Good morning, everyone. Bear with me 1 minute while we get all of the tech stuff set up. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. I'm here live over on Instagram as well as Facebook, so bear with me. We're just trying to make sure everything looks good. So good morning. My name is Meg Wheeler. I am the Democratic candidate for the Massachusetts State Senate in the Plymouth and Norfolk District that covers the towns of Cohasset, Duxbury, Hingham, Hull, Marshfield, Norwell, Scituate, and Weymouth. And I'm here today because I wanted to do a bit of a recap. Yesterday was a very big day in the Massachusetts State Senate. They debated for 17 hours the police reform bill. Reform Shift Bill. This is Senate Bill 2800 if you're following along at home and want to look it up. And I wanted to really go over a few things today that were very notable out of the bill. I wanted to offer my perspective on it, as well as pieces that I support, and then pieces that perhaps I don't support or I think need additional work. If you've got any questions for those watching live, please feel free to drop them in the comments. I'm going to do my best here to manage all the different platforms we're on. And so we'll get to those questions. But before I do that, and hey, everybody joining me on Instagram, I see you all. Welcome everyone on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Thank you so much for tuning in live. Again, I'm Meg Wheeler. I'm the Democratic candidate for the Massachusetts State Senate in the Plymouth and Norfolk District. So let's just do a bit of an overview first in case folks aren't familiar with this bill or maybe haven't been following it along. So again, it's S2800, Senate Bill 2800. It's an act to reform police standards and shift resources to build a more equitable, fair, and just Commonwealth that values Black lives and communities of color. So this bill was sponsored by the Senate Ways and Means Committee. It was headed up by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz and Senator William Brownsberger. Essentially, a committee was formed to create this bill. They've been working on it for several weeks now, actually probably about a month now. And so it came out of Ways and Means last Monday. It went to the Senate floor last Thursday. It was supposed to go to the Senate floor for debate. Unfortunately, Senate Republicans decided to delay the debate on this bill. And so they voted to table it on Thursday, on Friday, on Saturday. And then it was able to come to a debate because you can only do that 3 times. It was able to come to a debate on Monday. So yesterday, the Senate did debate it for over 17 hours. So one thing I wanted to point out, and I've got notes here because I want to make sure we cover everything. There's a lot to cover, so bear with me. But Senator Chang Diaz, again, who's one of the primary writers of this bill, essentially came out and said that when they looked at this bill, they looked at 3 different categories of components to this bill. So the first is fighting racism. The second is reducing the risk of police misconduct. And the third was to shift from force and punishment to de-escalation and helping. Now, the senators did also take into consideration the bill that the governor filed. So the governor filed House Bill 4794. My understanding is that that is in committee. It has not been discussed or voted on yet. And that the House itself is actually intending to file their own bill as well. And Chris says 223 separate amendments to slow it down, stop it. Unbelievable. Yeah. So there were a considerable amount of amendments for this bill. And I, give everyone a lot of credit for working through all of them yesterday. I think the bill and Senator Chang Diaz said this in her, I believe this was her opening remarks on Thursday, but don't quote me on that. It might've been Friday or Saturday. Basically said, they did their best to put all of the necessary components into this bill, but they recognized that there were still pieces that were missing, that there were certainly sections that were compromises. And so I think a lot of the amendments do reflect that, but there are also plenty of amendments that, to Chris's point, really were intended to slow it down, to stop it, to water it down. And I'll talk about a few of those here today. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key provisions of this bill. And so I think the first one I want to talk about is the bill itself. Now the bill, again, does a lot. I'm going to try to just highlight some of the key features. I'm not going to cover everything. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities where I'll be back here to talk about this because it's such an important conversation. But the first thing that the bill does that I think is really important is it bans chokeholds. This is essentially what killed George Floyd. And this is a really cruel tactic that's used to harm people. And so I'm really glad to see that. Now there was, I'm going to go over exactly what the bill says, because I think the devil's in the details, right? But I do want to just note a few other things as well as we're talking about deadly force. Senator Becca Rausch actually sponsored an amendment that would have banned tear gas. My understanding from my watching it is that there were some changes to that amendment. And hey, buddy, my toddler decided to pop in right now, of course. There were some changes to that amendment. And so tear gas is not completely banned. I'll talk about exactly what the bill says. Hey, buddy, can you go lay down for a minute, please? Or go play with your train. You go play with your train? Yeah. Okay, cool. But I did want to note that so the amendment she put forward, the revised amendment she put forward, essentially required police departments to work with protest organizers on essentially a de-escalation plan, and make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page before protests happen, and to also appoint or designate an officer in charge of de-escalation planning and communication, so that basically trying to get ahead of any potential issues that might happen. Not right now, buddy. Mommy's using her phone. I'm really sorry. Why don't you go grab your train and bring it in? Okay, cool. There was an amendment, amendment number 62. It would have allowed chokeholds in self-defense. My opponent, Senator O'Connor, supported this amendment. This is an amendment that I absolutely would have not supported. I do not believe that the additional language proposed in this amendment is necessary, nor do I feel it's beneficial. I think it actually does more harm than good. Thankfully, it was rejected 3 votes to 36. So let's talk about what it actually says in the bill in terms of physical force. So basically, there's a few different components. The first is that no physical force is allowed unless de-escalation tactics have been attempted and failed or are not feasible, and such force is necessary to 1, affect the lawful arrest of a person, 2, prevent the escape from custody of a person, or 3, prevent imminent harm, and the amount of force used is proportional to the threat of imminent harm. So you're going to see these 2 common themes come up in a lot of what I talk about today. The first is that essentially de-escalation didn't work. And so there are going to be a lot of things in the bill that you can't do unless de-escalation doesn't work. And the second is there are going to be a lot of things in the bill that an officer can't do unless there's a threat to threat to imminent harm or threat of imminent harm, and it's a proportional response. So that's a piece of it as well. The second piece of this is that no deadly force is allowed, again, unless de-escalation tactics have been tried and failed, or are not feasible, and such force is necessary to prevent imminent harm, and the amount of force used is proportional. And then the other piece of this is it bans shooting in a moving vehicle, again, unless necessary to prevent imminent harm, and the discharge is proportional to the threat of imminent harm to a person. And they make clear in the bill that the use of using the vehicle, so someone trying to take the vehicle, does not constitute imminent harm. Look, I'm not an attorney. I will say I'm concerned by the references to physical force not being allowed unless de-escalation tactics have been attempted and failed or are not feasible. That feels kind of wishy to me. I feel like that's very subjective, and I have concerns about what that actually means. But more discussions to come on that. Now, going back to my point about Senator Rausch's amendment and how she wanted to completely ban tear gas, what the bill says at this point is that no tear gas or other chemical weapons discharge rubber pellets or release a dog to control or influence. So you cannot do any of those things. You can't have tear gas, you can't have chemical weapons, you can't discharge rubber pellets, you can't release dogs, unless, again, I said we're going to keep hearing this, unless de-escalation tactics have been attempted and failed or are not feasible, and measures used are necessary to prevent imminent harm, and the foreseeable harm inflicted by the tear gas or other tactics is proportional to the imminent harm. I just want to point out here, look, I'm by no means a tear gas expert. Senator Rausch spoke very passionately on the floor last night about the harm of tear gas and other chemical weapons, and it really is incredibly scary, the permanent and lasting effects that tear gas and chemical weapons can have on us. It's not just the immediate effect of, not being able to see or not being able to breathe, but it's potentially long-lasting effects, especially to women, on our reproductive systems. So I'm very concerned that tear gas and other chemical weapons are still allowed in this bill, that they have not been banned completely. I am pleased to see that, certainly they've made it harder to implement them, that it's not the first piece of it, but I'm worried about the language and that it's not strong enough. And Chris says the problem will be case-by-case subjectivity if necessary, and what will count as a failure of de-escalation. I agree. And Chris is an attorney, so I appreciate that my concern is actually apparently a legitimate one by an attorney telling me this. So good. Thank you, Chris, for that. But yeah, that's definitely my concern in all of this bill. And hold on. It's never good when someone decides to call you when you're in the middle of a live because it pauses the video. So sorry about that. Hopefully folks on Instagram can still see me. That's my concern with a lot of the things in this bill, and again, I understand that they had to make some compromises. This is definitely a step in the right direction. It's better than we were at. I want to make that very clear. And I really do applaud the senators, including Senator Chang Diaz and Senator Brownsberger, who worked so hard on this bill. So by no means am I sort of trying to downplay their efforts, but yes, I do have some concerns that this bill does not go far enough, that there is too much subjectivity here. There's too much room for judgment in this, too much room for explaining away how something was justified, and that concerns me. The last thing I want to say in terms of physical force is the bill does add in a duty to intervene when another officer is using physical force, including deadly physical force. And again, this is, kind of a subjective thing, but I will say one piece that I like about the bill with all of these, whether it's the chokeholds or the tear gas or whatever it may be, or even the duty to intervene, is that there is now required filing and reporting after any of these incidents happen, so that at a minimum, we will know when it happens, we will know why it happened, and we will, and they have to detail the circumstances of what justified the action, what, if they couldn't use de-escalation tactics or if they failed, explaining that. So at least we'll have that data, we'll have that reporting, it'll allow an investigation to happen. The second thing, speaking of investigations, the second thing that the bill calls for is a certification system and a new civilian-led board. The bill essentially creates this independent commission, the Police Officers Standards and Accreditation Committee. It would certify all law enforcement officers and give this agency the power to renew, revoke, modify their licenses in any way. And they also can conduct investigations into allegations of misconduct, especially including the use of excessive force. So, again, I think this to me is really where the strength of this bill lives or dies, is in the power of this commission or this civilian-led board. And so I'm going to be watching really closely to see how this is set up to ensure that they are actually given the power that they need to regulate this stuff. And I think the true test of this bill really will lie in their ability to do their job. Let's talk next about data collection real fast, and no-knock warrants. So there were a few different pieces in the bill and also amendments that talked about data collection. There were definitely some concerns. So there's sort of two buckets here. The first bucket is wanting to make sure that we collect data on what's happening. So for example, I talked about the required reporting if chokeholds are used, if tear gas is used, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really important for us to better understand what's going on, to be able to do proper investigations. The second kind of reporting bucket is, especially in schools when things are happening, wanting to limit the ability of schools to actually report to law enforcement so that kids aren't kind of getting flagged as being issues ahead of time, and then law enforcement's getting engaged, right? And so this is really meant to protect children. It's meant to keep their environment safe, to ensure that these problems can be dealt with outside of law enforcement so that kids aren't being profiled. So a couple different buckets of amendments there and pieces of bills there. And yep, Chris said the creation of a statewide, here, I forgot I have this fun tool, I can put this up and y'all can see it. The creation of a statewide incident database regarding abuse complaints and excessive force accessible to the public will be a huge step. Eliminating facial recognition and biometrics is also huge. Yes, thank you, Chris, for mentioning that as well, because I don't think I wrote that down on my notes, but they did also eliminate the facial recognition piece. So thank you for that. Emily says the thought of using tear gas while we're fighting a deadly respiratory virus just blows my mind. Yeah, Emily, I agree with you. And look, I could talk about this for hours. It's so troubling to me that we're still even talking about using tear gas and it wasn't banned completely. I know Senator Roush, was really fighting for it to be banned completely. And I thank her for her efforts there. Chris apologizes for using the president's word huge. That's okay, Chris. I think we can still use the word. I don't know. It's okay. But anyway, so data collection was a big piece of this. Also another piece of this is the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security will create an annual report on the total number of warrants issued. This is going to no-knock warrants now. Total number of warrants issued, and then also for each warrant, basically what led to the warrant being issued, what the alleged offense was, when the warrant was executed, where it was executed, whether it resulted in the discovery or seizure of any property or evidence, excuse me, and whether the execution of the warrant resulted in any injuries or deaths. I want to mention that there was an amendment to ban no-knock warrants. I don't actually, my team can check me on this. I don't actually think they ended up voting on it. I think it was withdrawn. This was sort of the compromise was let's at least collect the data. Again, I don't think it goes far enough, but it's a step in the right direction. Hopefully the data will give us the power to be able to ban them in the future. Let's talk really quickly, since I was talking about data, about protecting students from profiling. So again, I was talking about kind of that second data bucket of really protecting our kids from being reported to law enforcement. So school department personnel and school resource officers now cannot disclose information about students or students' family members to law enforcement officers, agencies, and that's at every level. So it builds in this additional layer of protection. Again, this is as long as there is no imminent threat of harm, or if they think a student is going to actually commit a crime and there is a risk there, then obviously law enforcement can be engaged in that. But this is really meant to protect kids from profiling. I want to talk about a couple of other commissions before I get to the really big piece of the bill that I'm excited to talk about. Another commission that was set up is a permanent commission on the status of African Americans. This will include people, 3 people appointed by the governor from a list provided by the New England NAACP, 3 people appointed by the Senate from a list provided by the Massachusetts Black and Latino Caucus, and then 3 additional people appointed by the Speaker of the House from a list provided by the Mass Black and Latino Caucus. And their primary function is to make policy recommendations to ensure that Black people equitably benefit from government services, amend laws that exclude or disproportionately harm Black people, and then promote solutions that address the discrimination of Black people. So it's a permanent commission. They've been given, quite a bit of power in there. They've been given some funding, so we'll see how that works out. There was another commission that was established as well in this bill. It's the Commission for Correction and Juvenile Detention Officers, because some of you may be watching and thinking, well, this is great. We're doing all this talk about police officers, but what about correction officers? What about juvenile detention officers? And that definitely was a piece of the conversation yesterday. And so this commission will review and make recommendations on improving, modernizing, and developing comprehensive protocols for the training of these officers. They also, will make recommendations to establish clear limitations on the use of physical force. And they will establish basically recommendations to create an independent body that will have, similar to the police body that's being created, that will have the power to certify, renew, revoke, or modify certification and to investigate complaints. So I think this is, and by the way, this commission will be very diverse. So it will include folks from the legal and criminal justice system, but it will also include representatives from the New England NAACP, as well as criminal justice reform organizations. So Citizens for Juvenile Justice, Prisoners Legal Services, Families for Justice's Healing, as well as reps from the Mass Black and Latino Caucus. And this commission, I don't see this as a delay tactic. I think their date has been given to bring their findings back of next July. So, they are charged with this duty to come back with recommendations so that this bill or this important policy work can expand further to really cover correction officers and juvenile detention officers. And I think this is so critically important that we're ensuring that, that these policies extend to that area as well and aren't just limited to police officers. Okay, so the last piece that's in the bill that I want to talk about, and this was the controversy. This was the biggest controversy. It's my understanding that this was why the Senate Republicans, it's why the Senate Republicans basically kept delaying. It's not why they said they were delaying, but it's why they were delaying. And that is this concept of qualified immunity. So if you aren't familiar with qualified immunity basically shields government officials like police officers from personal liability when there is a situation where they are being accused of violating someone's constitutional right. And the right to not excuse me, the right to not experience excessive police force is one of these examples. So it shields them essentially from personal liability, monetary damages, so long as they did not violate clearly established law. And the challenge with qualified immunity, really at this point, is just the fact that it sets the bar so high for plaintiffs to really be able to overcome it. And be able to hold police officers and other law enforcement officials accountable. And in many of these cases, this is the only way they can be held accountable, because in the absence of laws like banning chokeholds, this is really the only option for someone who has suffered excessive police force or whose family member has. So qualified immunity, very, very big deal. It was written into the bill to limit qualified immunity. And then there were many amendments that essentially tried to whittle away at it, including amendments that were sponsored and or co-sponsored by my opponent, Senator O'Connor. So here's what was, so ultimately, I would say, and maybe a lawyer reading this would disagree with me, but ultimately I would say that what was written into the bill was watered down a little bit. I would also say that what is in the bill doesn't go far enough, but here's what's in the bill. So it says, in an action for monetary damages under this section, and this section refers to being able to sue civilly for constitutional violations. Qualified immunity shall not apply unless no reasonable defendant could have had reason to believe that such conduct would violate the law at the time the conduct occurred. So that's the first piece of it. And so essentially it's limiting qualified immunity, but it's still allowing for it in a very narrow situation. It also says in this bill, nothing in this section shall affect the provisions of Chapter 258 with respect to indemnification of public employees. So this was a really big deal. This seemed to be the sticking point, is that a lot of people who are in the public sector were concerned that they would no longer be indemnified from their actions. And Chris, I'm going to pop up Chris's comment here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it all. It's going to hide my face, but that's okay. Chris says, for those who are unaware of what this is, the qualified immunity doctrine as applied to police acts as a potential shield to protect the police from being held liable for their actions when they are pursued for excessive force. The doctrine initially asks two questions. Did the police use excessive force? And if they did, should they have known that their conduct was illegal because it violated a clearly established prior court ruling that barred such conduct? And I can't see the rest of it because my little tool doesn't let me see the rest of it, but I'll pull up Facebook here, and that way I can read the rest of Chris's comment there. So Chris, thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying. I'm definitely not an attorney, hashtag not a lawyer. So I really appreciate you expanding on that for us. But so the qualified immunity piece was a really big piece of this. And it was the piece that, I think they started debating it maybe around, like 10 or 11 at night. And it took several hours. And, I just to speak really candidly, I want to say that one of the things that concerns me the most, about the conversation that I heard and about the debate that I heard over qualified immunity is, several senators stood up and spoke and said, I'm really concerned about what this does for our police families. I'm really concerned about what this does for, for hardworking police officers and their families who are concerned about doing their jobs and concerned they're going to lose everything. And let me be very clear here. I'm not against the police. I know many police officers who are incredibly good people and they're doing good work. I'm against the police system. I'm against systemic police violence, systemic racism that is inherent in our law enforcement system, in our criminal justice system. But what concerned me about the senators speaking out about this is that they weren't also then talking about the horrific injustices that our Black community members are facing and the fear that those people are having in their families. That any Black person who, is in our communities right now is terrified for his or her life. And that to me is something we need to be talking about more. And there were a few senators who did bring that to the floor, and I appreciate them for bringing that up. But what concerns me is that there was an emphasis placed on how to water down this piece of the bill because of the potential harm that it might cause to some police officers. Look, my understanding from all of my research on this issue and everything I've looked at across the country is eliminating qualified immunity only hurts police officers who are doing something wrong. It does not hurt good police officers. So the fact that we have watered this down out of fear, out of pandering to police unions, is doing a disservice to the Black members of our community. Chris said, these families should adhere to the old conservative advice then. If you don't do anything about it, you've got nothing to worry about. Exactly, right? Exactly. I mean, this is I think the challenge. So so look, so where did qualified immunity end up? Oh, I also wanted to mention, actually, I apologize. And my team can check me on this. I believe it was Senator Brownsberger and Senator Lesser both spoke to the Springfield Police Department. I believe it was last year. There was an investigation done on their narcotics unit. And the investigation found that they regularly, on a regular basis, use excessive force. Regularly. And I say this because I think it's really easy to forget that this happens here in our communities. I think about, my local police department and my local police chief, who I love. They're great. They're incredible assets to this community, and I'm so glad we have them. And I, in my mind, think, well, this would never happen here, but it does. It happens here, and Springfield was an example of that. So I just appreciate those senators bringing that to the floor and reminding everyone, both in the Senate and in the public, that this does happen here. Also, I wanted to mention there was a Suffolk University poll in late June that was conducted. WGBH conducted this. And they actually found that 75% of Massachusetts residents think people should be able to sue police officers individually for misconduct. 75%. So when you're seeing all of this stuff come out today about protecting police officers and their families and all of that, please understand that that's being driven by the police unions. That's being driven by people whose sole job is to ensure that police are not held accountable for their actions. And I want to reiterate what I said just a few minutes ago. I support police officers. I support individual police officers who are doing their jobs and are protecting our communities. And many of the reforms that I advocate for are actually so that they can do their jobs easier and better, and they're not burdened by all of the things that we have put on them and expected them to do, like mental health treatment. So I support individual police officers. I do not support systemic police violence. I do not support our policing system as it stands, because it is leading and contributing to systemic racism. And so for me, when we're talking about qualified immunity, this is a no-brainer. This is not something we should need to study. By the way, there was an amendment put forward that would have created a commission to study qualified immunity. We don't need to study this. Other people have studied this. People have been doing the work for us. We know what the reality is about qualified immunity. We don't need to spend any more time delaying it at the expense of our Black and brown brothers and sisters. So I'm pleased to say that the amendment that would have created a commission to study it was overturned 16-24. I would recommend you look at those 16 that voted in support of delaying this work on qualified immunity. And if you live in their districts, vote them out. Vote them out on November 3rd, because they are not working towards racial justice. They are not prioritizing the lives and the well-being and the safety of our Black and brown communities. So please look at that amendment. Please look at who voted to basically delay any implementation or any reduction of qualified immunity. Too many people's lives depend on this stuff, and I'm very saddened that there were 16 votes to keep qualified immunity. Okay, so that covers the majority of the bill. There's obviously a ton more in it. We're not, even scratching the surface on everything. I want to talk really quickly, actually, about what wasn't in the bill, what didn't get put in the bill. Now, some of this is good, some of this is bad. So I just talked about the amendment that would have created a commission to study qualified immunity. I don't actually have the amendment number for that. It was Overturn 16 to 24. There was also another amendment, amendment number 85. It was sponsored by my opponent, Senator O'Connor, which also formed a commission to study qualified immunity. So I do want to note that my opponent believes that qualified immunity should be kicked down the road. I do not. If I had been able to vote in the Senate last night, I 100% would have supported eliminating qualified immunity. There were also several attempts by Senate Republicans to focus on training of law enforcement instead of changing the laws, including Amendment 79, also sponsored by my opponent. So, again, I mean, look, training is not bad, but training does not solve the problem. Training is not what we need right now. Training is another way to kick the can down the road. It is another way to delay. It is another way to hide the real issue here. Amendment 99, also by my opponent, removed the change to school resource officers in the bill. So school resource officers, I know, has been kind of a hot topic recently. Essentially what the bill does, it's a very simple change, is it essentially says that school resource officers would be made available at the request of the schools, whereas before they were made available in consultation with schools and police departments. So now it's putting the responsibility on schools to say they want them or they don't, so that schools can really make the right choice for their students. My opponent filed an amendment, which thankfully was voted down, that would have removed that change and would have continued to mandate school resource officers in schools, regardless of whether or not the school felt that was necessary or appropriate. There was also an amendment to overturn that Correction and Juvenile Officers Commission that I mentioned. This is a really important commission to bring the Senate recommendations on further policies that we can implement that limit excessive force in our correction facilities, among juvenile offenders. It would have really given protections to people who right now do not have protections at all. And so I think that's a really important commission. And I'm glad to say the amendment that would have removed the commission was voted down. Lastly, and this one to me was perhaps the most obvious and laughable delay tactic, was Amendment 117. My opponent was a co-sponsor of this amendment, which would have conducted a financial study over the next 18 months of this bill. So essentially delaying this bill for 18 months to find out what the bill costs. Now, the Senate has already come out and said that this bill will cost around $5 million. I believe it was Senator Tarr, don't quote me on that, but I believe it was Senator Tarr that spoke on Amendment 117 and basically said, okay, we know $5 million to the state. What's the cost to local towns? And therefore, wanted to have this study done over the next 18 months that would have essentially pushed out implementation of this bill for over a year and a half. Let me be clear here. I mean, look, I would have voted against this amendment, no question, but let me just take this one step further. While I am very aware of the need to do the financial due diligence on the policies we pass, I have a background in finance. I understand the implications here. When it comes to racial justice and when it comes to implementing policies that keep our Black and Brown community members safe and alive, I don't care what the price tag is there. I do not care. Okay? I don't need a study to tell me what it's going to cost to then decide if we're going to pass it or not. To me, this is a bill that gets passed because it needs to be passed and we figure out how to pay for it because this is a priority. I've said this before, but where we put our money is where we put our priorities. And if we're making this bill about money, then we're already saying there is a price that we're willing to put on Black lives. And I don't know if we're willing to pay it. And you know what? That's not how I roll. I am willing, no matter the cost, to fight for Black lives because every single Black life matters to me and is valuable, and there's not a price tag that I can put on that. So I am horrified that this amendment even existed. It was clearly a delay tactic, but it even goes so far beyond that to try to put a price tag on Black lives. And I can't even find words. I'm so angry about the fact that this even existed. And you know what? I'm even angrier that the state senator in my district right now, who represents me, voted for this and co-sponsored this. No, thank you. Chris says conservatives value price over people once again. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely they do. Okay, so to wrap this up, I just want to talk really quickly about some overall takeaways. I said this at the beginning. I will say it again. I am very, very grateful to the senators who worked so hard to put this together. Senator Sonia Chang Diaz, I just heard a crash. Hopefully my son, I hear laughing, so hopefully my son's good. Senator Sonia Chang Diaz, Senator William Brownsberger, senators who put forward some really good amendments, Senator Eldridge, Senator Sear, Senator Roush. I'm definitely forgetting a few, so I apologize to those senators. And I'm very grateful that this bill came out of really hard work with so many people in the community. Let's be clear, this bill wasn't written behind closed doors. The Senate working group that worked on this met with representatives from community organizations, from organizations that represented the stakeholders in this bill. So this truly was a bill that had, even though it didn't officially have a public hearing, truly came out of public comment. So I'm incredibly grateful that it exists. It doesn't go far enough. And the senators that I've referenced have said that. This is not a disputed point for many of us, but it doesn't go far enough. It did not ban no-knock warrants. I don't believe it takes use of force far enough. As I've already said, qualified immunity, it doesn't eliminate it completely, which I'd like it to do. Look, the officer who murdered George Floyd, at least under our bill, the way I read it, that officer would not have been wrong, until the very, very end. And that's a concern for me. So I think we really need to take a hard look at this bill. It's a step in the right direction. I'm glad that it's been passed through the Senate. I hope that the House takes up this bill and doesn't further weaken it. I hope that the governor signs this. I hope we continue to do the really hard work that we all need to do, especially us white people need to do in addressing our privilege and our role in systemic racism. And I hope that this bill is just the beginning of more work to be done in the Senate. And I look forward, when I'm in the state Senate next year, to being a part of that. I look forward to sponsoring legislation that takes this bill further and really gives our Black community members the protections and the rights and the safety that they deserve and have been denied for too many hundreds of years. But I also want to say that this is just one piece of the puzzle. This is just police reform. We still need massive, massive overhaul and reform on environmental justice, on housing, on the economy, on economic opportunities. There are so many other areas where systemic racism is still alive and well and is being perpetuated every single day by the policies that we have all put into place. And I say we have all because look at who's in office. Unless you're getting out and voting against the people in office who are perpetuating these policies, then you're a part of the problem. So I ask you to join me on September 1st in the primary and November 3rd and vote against our elected officials who told us yesterday that racial justice is not a priority for them. My opponent, our senator in our district who represents me and everyone else in this district, didn't even take a vote on this bill. At the end of the day, at 4 a.m., after 17 hours of debate about this, and after hundreds of years of Black people being systemically oppressed and murdered, the best he could do was vote present. I would almost respect him more if he had voted no. I do not understand how on a massive piece of legislation like this that is so critically important to too many people, you cannot bother to vote yay or nay. I would have voted yes for this bill. I support this bill. Even though I believe it does not go far enough, I support it. It is a step in the right direction. We need more, and we need elected officials who are willing to fight for that. So I look forward to being that person for you in November and starting next year in the state Senate. This is a conversation that needs to continue to happen. It's an issue we need to continue to take action on. And I'm excited, I suppose, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but excited to that there's momentum now, because for too long there wasn't. So I will leave it there. If anyone has questions, I don't think I missed any questions. Thank you for everyone who joined live. I don't see any questions over here on Instagram. I see a bunch of folks watching live. Hey, everyone. Sorry, I've been doing bad with the waving. I'm doing my best. Oops, what did I just do? I hit something. I hit something. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to give it another second because I know there's a bit of delay. Any questions, I'm happy to answer now. If you'd like to learn more about my campaign, head on over to megwheeler.com. You can always donate, megwheeler.com/donate. I was like, I'm sure we have a little banner. We do have a little banner there. And again, I'm happy to take any questions. There is more in this bill. So check it out. We're happy to answer any questions. We'll be providing more information on this bill as we go through it. We watched every moment of the 17 hours yesterday, but there's obviously a lot, and we're still going through all of it to fully understand all of the implications. But I'm glad to see that this bill happened, and I really do thank the senators who were champions of this bill. I thank them for stepping up and for doing what's right in this time when that is necessary, when people's lives literally rely on that. So, all right, thanks everyone. I'm going to leave it there. I will talk to you all soon, and I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. Bye.